We are up to two dots. Today's daf, sorry, Mesechet Zevachim, beginning of Seder Kachim. In Daf Yomi is Daf Zayin, number 7. And we're continuing our discussion about when you bring a karban, if you bring the karban for purposes other than what's correct, right? You're supposed to shecht it for the owner, for them to get a kapara, or for them to do something nice, and obviously have the right animal in mind, the right karban, the chata, and ola, etc. And we've talked the last couple of days about these different sets and these different kind of thoughts that would pass on a karban. Says the Gemara today, Itzmar. We're at the 2 dots now, 10 lines or so from the top of Daf Zayin Amud Aleph. Let's say you take a toda.
It's not opening. There's some problem with this system.
Can you hear me, Ken?
He shuts off, he comes on, he comes off. Connection.
No problems here.
Okay. So you have a karban toda. Toda sheshachta l'shem todat chavero. Right? So you have a karban toda. Remember, a karban toda is a kind of shlamim. We're going to get into the details, but it was generally brought as a thank you to Hashem. And we discussed that there are specific things the person goes to, gets sick and they gets better, or goes on a trip and is shipwrecked, that they bring a karban toda for. So, but let's say 2 people show up in the Beit HaMikdash with the karban toda, and the Kohen does the wrong, or the person does shechts it for the wrong person, meaning there's 2 animals, animal A and B. Kohen goes over to animal A and says, I'm doing this for Ruvain, and really it's for Shimon. So Rabbah says kshera. Rabbah says that's not a problem. It's kosher, and the owner gets a kapara. The true owner, who's Ruvain, or Shimon, I guess in this case, gets a kapara, even though it was done for Ruvain, because it's the same animal, same kind of karban. Rav Chisda says it's psula, meaning that it doesn't fulfill the owner's responsibility to bring a karban toda. Why? Rabba Amar Kshera. Rabba says it's not a problem, even though it was done for the wrong owner, because Toda L'Shem Toda Nishchata. It was run for the right karban. So the Kohen had intention to bring a karban Toda. He brought a karban Toda. He thought it was for Ruvain and really was for Shimon, but that's not a problem for a karban Toda. For a Chata it might be, but for Toda it's not. If Chisda says, no, psula, because the Shum Shlamim Didei Nishchata Be'inan. You need to have this not only shechted as a shlamim, but as his shlamim. And how do I know that? Well, we'll see in a second. Amar Rabba, Mina Min Allah, how do I know that it's kosher? The Tanya, based on the following Braita. The Braita, and this is a Braita, of course, about karban toda, which says, Ubesar zevach todat shlamav, biyom mikrivo tzivcho ye'achel, right? That on a person who has meat of a zevach, which means a sacrifice, of a toda, that's shlamim, on the day he brings it, he should eat it. So what is that? What's the Torah telling you there? Why is it saying the todat shlamav? Abachanan Amar Mishum Rebbe Eliezer, this is the Braita. Abachanan says the name of Rebbe Eliezer, Balilamed. The Torah is teaching you that a toda can be a shlamim, basically, meaning toda sheshachta l'shem shlamim kshira. That if you shecht your toda and you think it's something else, now something else that's similar to it, meaning a shlamim, that is kosher. It still is a toda. You brought the animal appropriately. However, shlamim shenishchata l'shem toda psulim, but the opposite way would not be true. If you took a karban shlamim, a regular shlamim, and you brought it to Beit HaMikdash, and the person slaughtering it said, I'm doing this for a purpose of a karban toda, it doesn't fulfill the obligation for the owner. Maya fresh ben zelazah asked the Braita, what's the difference? Why does it work in one direction, not the other direction? Because of this pasuk. Because toda kriya shlamim, vein shlamim kriyim toda. A toda is called a shlamim because it says todat shlamav, and so basically within the subset of shlamim is included toda. And so if you do a toda for a shlamim, it's kosher, but a shlamim is not called a toda, so it doesn't work the other way. Says Rabbah now, so now I've read this Braita, and what this Braita seems to say to you is that if you do a shlamim l'shem toda, it's psula. But if you bring a karban, the Braita says it explicitly. You bring a shlamim for a toda, it's not kosher. But a toda l'shem shlamim would be kosher. But my implication, the Braita did not address the case that we argued about, which is ha-toda l'shem toda keshera, right? A toda brought for a different person's toda in mind would be kosher. My love, right? Because it's very similar to chavrei. right? We assume that the Braita, which is talking about you're bringing a shlamim for a toda or toda for shlamim, means for somebody else's, another person's toda or shlamim. And what the Braita says is that if you bring a toda and you think it's a shlamim, it's kosher. So for sure, if you bring a toda and think it's a different toda, it should be kosher. Answers Rav Huna, that is it Rav Huna, sorry? Answers Rav Chisda, sorry. Answers Rav Chisda, no. You have it wrong, because D-day, what the Braita is referring to is if you bring it for your own carbon, meaning a person is chayav a shlamim and a toda. They bring their toda and they say it's a shlamim. Then it's kosher because it's for the same person. But there's no proof from this Braita that if you brought two todas, for example, of two different people and brought one for the other person, that it would still be kosher. So says Rav Chisda, you can't prove this to me from the Braita. Ask Rava back or the Gemara. So what you're saying then is that if you, according to Rav Chisda, that if you bring a toda for another person's toda, it would be puzzle. So then I don't understand why the Braita has to differentiate between a shlamim for toda and toda for shlamim, be differentiated about a more specific case, which is a toda for another person's toda. So aditani shlamim l'shem toda psula, instead of saying in the Braita that a toda that was shechted for a shlamim is puzzle, say toda l'shem toda would be puzzle if it was another person. V'kol shekin shlamim l'shem toda. And for sure, if it was a shlamim l'shem toda, right? So there's why, according to Rav Chisda, would the Braita say it the way it said it? Answers the Gemara, that's not a proof against Rav Chisda, because shlamim l'shem toda, it's toda d-day, it's strichle. We need to tell you a chiddush in the Braita that if you're bringing a shlamim, even for your own toda, meaning an individual person has to bring a shlamim and a toda. He's got two animals that he's required to bring. He brings them both to the Beit HaMikdash, and he says, for his shlamim, I'm doing this one for the toda, right? So it's for himself. But that's a chiddush, and even though it's for himself, it's not kosher. I mean, I would have thought that midit toda kriya shlamim nami kriya toda, that from the fact that we call it toda a shlamim, we go vice versa, meaning they're essentially overlapping karbanot, and you could call a shlamim a toda and it would be kosher. And if you take a shlamim and you shecht it for a toda, it would be kosher. Kamash Malan, the chiddush of the Braita is that it's not the case. And so this is, again, one way to read the Braita, according to Rav Chisda. Rabba's way of reading the Braita, can't say Rabba, but I think it's Rava, right? Rava's way of reading the Braita is that a toda can be brought as a shlamim because it's included, and for sure a toda can be brought as another toda, right? And that's my proof. A shlamim can't be brought as a toda. Says Rav Chisda, the detail of the Braita is not so much a toda and a shlamim, it's whether it's the same person. And so a same person can bring their toda as a shlamim, and the same person can bring their toda as a different toda. So Rav Chisda would admit that if a person had two nice things happen to them, they had to bring two karbanot toda. They were sick and they were saved from a shipwreck, right? So they can bring them, and even if they bring the one for the purpose that he meant for the other, that would be kosher for himself. But still, says Rav Chisda, I disagree if you brought the toda for somebody else's toda, and I say that the owner would not get forgiveness and would have to bring another one. So that is that machloket. We're going to pause there because it's not, the next thing doesn't continue exactly from that. But that is a machloket about one animal for another animal. Now, says Rava, let me tell you.
I was going to jump in.
Yeah.
What's not discussed here is that a toda has different rules from a shlamim.
In terms of the time you eat it, you mean?
In terms of the time to eat it, and you have to bring the toda with a lot of bread.
Right, for sure. And let me just clarify. So everything we're talking about now is shchita, presumably, right? The question of what happens next, right? The Kohen says, oh my gosh, I made a mistake. I brought it for Ruvain. That you could then switch back, right? So meaning bringing the bloods, putting it on the mizbeach, you would do for the right person, potentially. Again, that's a different discussion, which we've had, and we'll continue.
Right.
But what you're saying is absolutely correct. You'd have to do it for the right rules, right? Continuing right now to two dots. So we're 2/3 of the way down. Says Rava, let me give you a little bit of an overview. And some of this is things we discussed in the last week, in our beginning of our Masechta, most of it at least. Says Rava, chatat sheshachta l'shem chatat kshera, right? If a person shechs a karban chatat for another karban chatat for the same person, it's kosher. Meaning, let's say a person does two sins. He eats chelev and he eats dam. It's always our case, right? He eats fats of an animal, he eats the blood of an animal. He separates two animals. He brings them to the Beit HaMikdash, one for his sin of chelev, one for his sin of dam, and he shechs the one of chelev by mistake for one of dam. Says Rava, that's not a problem. It's the right owner. It's the right type of sacrifice. it's kosher. But, says Rava, and we had this earlier, l'shem ola psula. But if you shecht it, let's say this guy owes an ola, right? He owes many karbanot, and he says, I'm sacrificing this animal A, for my ola. And then he goes, oh my gosh, it really was for my chata. It's pasul, meaning it does not fulfill the obligation for his karban ola. My taima. Why is that? Because v'shachat oto lechatat. Torah says shecht it for a chatat. It doesn't say shecht it for your particular sin in the chatat. It says have in mind the chatat when you shecht the animal. Amar Rachmana. V'harei chatat l'shem chatat nishchata. You shechted it for its own thing. However, you have to shecht it for a chatat, and therefore, if you do it l'shem olah, it would be psula. Okay, you have to shecht it for a chatat, and that would be enough. But if you shecht it for an olah, it would be pasul. Furthermore, that's one halacha. Furthermore, said Rava, V'amar Rava. Now, I guess 12 lines on the bottom. First word on the line. Chatat sheshachta al mi shemukuyav chatat psula. Right? Let's say you switch the owners. Okay, so you take a karban chatat, you bring it into the Beit Hamikdash, and instead of shechting it for Ruvain, you shecht it for Shimon, right? Which is changing the baalim. We talked about this before. Says Rava, if Shimon is chayav a karban chatat, then the animal is pasul because you brought it for the wrong person. We'll see why in a second. Then the animal is pasul, right? And basically, you have to bring another one. However, al misha mechuyav olah kshira. But if the person who you shechted for, instead of saying, I'm doing this for Reuven, I'm doing this for Shimon, Shimon was not chayav a karban chatat. Shimon was chayav a karban olah, then it would be kosher. Now, we discussed this earlier in the week, that, remember, there are sets, right? So it only passes when you shechted shelo lishma, if you do it for something within the same set, because you're basically trying to put the chatat for somebody else when it's inappropriate. But if you're doing it for an ola, which is not what a chatat is brought for, it doesn't make the animal pasul. Of course, the person still should bring another karban chatat, but it's still kosher. Now, my taima, what's the reason for that? Says Rava, and again, we had this earlier. It says, sorry, where am I? My taima, because it says chiper alav. Right, you bring the animal and it gets a kapara for him, meaning it has to be where the kapara is for him, alav v'lo chavero, but it means chavero dum yadidei. It's when your friend or the person you brought it for by mistake is like you in that mechuyev kapara kamoto. That other person is chayav a kapara because they have to bring a korban chatat. So if you shecht Reuven's chatat for Shimon, if Shimon is chayav a chatat and was supposed to bring it, then the animal's pasul. If Shimon was chayiv an ola, then the animal's not pasul, and you can bring it. Of course, again, Reuven still has to bring another karban chatat. However, says Rava, and this gets a little bit even more complicated, Amar Rava, what if Shimon is not chayiv anything, right? So you took the animal for Reuven and said, I'm bringing this for Shimon. Shimon didn't do any chet. He didn't do anything that he would bring a karban for. Says Rava, chatat shechta al mish enu mechuyev klum. Let's say Shimon has no responsibility. Then it's psula. It is pasul. Now, why is it pasul? Right? Why isn't it like someone who's not in the same set and therefore it should be okay? Because someone who has no responsibility and therefore it should be okay. Says Rava, it's because she'ein lecha adam b'Yisrael she'ein mechuyev asay. Because look, there's no such thing. This is an appropriate thing to say right before Rosh Hashanah. There's no one who's perfect, right? So everyone in Klal Yisrael at some point was over a mitzvah asay. So really, even if you don't know about it or haven't thought about it, everyone has to bring a karban olah. Right? Now, has to, again, means it's voluntary. You don't have to. Bezdin won't force you. But everyone has done something wrong. And therefore, every Jew, basically, is in the category of someone who has to bring an olah. And so by bringing a karban chatat for that person, you're basically bringing a chatat for a person who's chayiv an olah, even if he doesn't know it, says Rava. And that's the chiddush here. So since for an olah would be pasul, every person basically is pasul. Now, the Amar Rava, and it says Rava, in a related halacha, that chatat mechaper to chayvei asay mikal v'chomer. That the truth is, let's say a person has to, again, didn't make kiddush on Shabbos. Let's say it's a mitzvah to say, or he wasn't zachar yom Shabbat, right? So he has to bring a karban olah. Let's say he also is mechal Shabbat because he forgot on Shabbos, right? So he has to bring a lo taseh. He has to bring a karban chatat. Says Rava, that karban chatat can be mechaper on his mitzvah taseh. Why mikal v'chomer? It's a kal v'chomer. Al chayvei kritut mechaperet. The karban chatat is mechaper for achiv karet, like Shabbos, achivua, asay lo kol shekain. For sure, it should be mechaper on his mitzvah taseh. So it turns out that if you bring a karban chatat, you don't have to bring a karban olah for that thing. Basically, it wipes your slate clean up to that point. Says the Gemara, but what Rav is then implying is the memra debat minahu. You're then saying it's the same type, meaning a karban brought for a chatat can replace a karban for an olah, which means it's the same family. Bat mina, it's the same type. V'amar Rava, but Rava just said, we quoted it 3 lines above, chatat sheshachta mish mechuyev chatat psula mish mechuyev olah kshera. Rava just said to me that if the person, you took Ruvain's chatat and shechted it for Shimon, if Shimon is chayiv a chatat, then they're the same type, same family, and the carbon's puzzle. But if Shimon is only chayiv and ola, it's not the same type. But so that implies they're different. But you just said that a carbon chatat can be brought for a mitzvah taseh. So make up your mind. Says the Gemara, turn to Daf Zayin Amud Bet, the top word. This is complicated. But as we said yesterday, mikiv'a lo mechapra. The kiv'ah, the kvi'ut, the permanency or the main role of the karban chatat is not for an aseh. It's not replace an ola. But mikufya mechapra, from the side point, right? As we said yesterday, the extra, the added on, it is mechapra. It has an incidental kind of kapara, meaning it's not like, and this we have like with the Yorshim yesterday, it's not the main kapara, and therefore it's not the same set, right? The main kapara of a karban chatat is for a lotase or for karet, right? But it drags along kapara for mitzvah taseh, and therefore, although it does do it, it's not considered to be the same set of that thing. And so Rav has sort of this middle ground where karban chatat can be mechaper for an aseh, but it's not the same set as an aseh or as an ola because it's not its main kapara.
But we learned about 2-3 days ago, and David made this very clear when he reviewed this, that if a person makes if he is giving a korban for somebody else, and that person has no chiyuv to bring anything, that it is a valid shchita, that you can accept the animal, the korban is accepted. It doesn't do it. For instance, so in this case, he was supposed to bring a chatat, and he brings and the other person owes an ola, for instance, owes. I'm between parentheses, but he was for an ola, so he can have intention. He can bring the chat, but in that case, it would be accepted. The korban would be accepted. The question, so that's. It would, but if the other person had to bring a chatat, it would not be accepted. It would not be with the korban would not be accepted.
Correct. So that's what Rava just said. He repeated that, but that's true. That's the exact same halacha. That a chatat that was brought for another person who has a chiyuv of chatat is pasul. For a person who has a chiyuv of an ola, it's kosher because the ola is not in the same set as the chatat. I think the question was, why not, right? If you get what we questioned just now, is if a chatat also gives you kapara on what an ola gives you, why is it not the same set? And the answer that Rava gave, top line, is that although a chatat might cause forgiveness for what is brought for an ola, it's not its main function. And again, so if a person, like you just said, exactly what you said, if a person is chayav only in ola and someone else brings their karban for that person, it doesn't pasul that karban. Continues Rava. Now we get to sort of the next detail that Charlie had raised a little bit earlier. This is again the top line of Daf Zayin Amud Bet, the last word on the line. Amar Rava, and furthermore says Rava, Ola sheshachta shelo lishma. Let's say you shecht an ola for the wrong purpose, right? So you bring in an ola and you say, I'm doing it for Shimon when really it's supposed to be done for Reuven. So we said earlier, it's still okay, right? Because it's an ola, it's not a chatat. But says Rava, asur lizrok dama shelo lishma. Obviously, you can't keep going shelo lishma. The animal was brought by Reuven for Reuven. You made a mistake. You did the shechita for Shimon. You then have to, if you realize your mistake, you got to go back and do the rest of it for Reuven. Why? Ibaite makra. Some people say it's based on a pasuk. Ibaite masvar. Some say it's just logic. Ibaite makra. Pasuk says, "Motzes tvatecha tishmar." Right. What comes out of your mouth, you should observe and do what you said. So you have to fulfill what the person promised. The person said, "I want to bring an ola." This is his ola. Ibaite masvara. Some say it's just logical. I mean, mishum deshani be kidreish pirka. Right, as we said earlier, just because we're some paraphrasing what we said before. Because you made one change, you should make more changes. Meaning, you made one mistake, stop your mistakes, and get back on track. As we said in the beginning of the Masechta, which is self-reference to earlier in Zevachim, which was on Daf Bet, where we said this. So that is the next principle of Rava. Furthermore, says Rava, Lamar Rava, where we now 7 lines from the top. Ola haba'a la'achar mita. right? So we get to a case, and we've had many cases like this already, where a person dies, right? So a person dedicates an Ola, and then Reuven says, I'm going to bring a carbon Ola, and then Reuven dies. So his Yorshim get that Ola, and they bring it to the Beit HaMikdash, and they're supposed to bring it as the carbon for their father. Remember, not every carbon is like this, but an Ola is like this. But let's say you make a mistake. So says Rava now, Ola haba achar mita, you're bringing an Ola after a person died, shachta b'shinoi kodesh, right? If you shech that Ola and you change what type of animal it is, you say, instead of an Ola, I'm shechting this for a chata, right? That's kodesh. Then it's psula. Then the animal is puzzle. We're going to see a little bit in a second why, but then the animal is puzzle, because the person basically, well, we had this earlier, but the person basically needs to get a kapara from their animal. They're not able to get a kapara shelo ba'alim l'shem chova, and because it's not done for the right sorry, it's not alul ba'alim l'shem chova. It's not a kosher animal at all because it's done for a different type of animal, right? And they don't get a kapara, and therefore you have to bring another one. But b'shinui ba'alim kshera. However, if you change the owners, meaning you, instead of saying, I'm bringing this carbon for Reuven who's died, you bring it for someone else, for Shimon. Then it's kosher. And the reason it's kosher is that since Reuven is really dead, ein ba'alim la'achar mita, there really is no kavua owner. So although you're bringing it for Reuven's Yerusha, we'll see why in a second, the fact is that the ownership aspect of it is lost. And if you change the owners, it doesn't puzzle the animal. That's what Rava said. And Rav Pinchas Breder of Ami Amar, Rav Pinchas Breder Ami disagreed, and he said, Yesh ba'alim la'achar mita, that there are owners after you die, which implies to us that if you then shech the animal of the dead person for a different owner, it would puzzle it. So that is the question. Amalei Rav Ashi, Rav Pinchas Breder of Ami. So Rav Ashi asked Rav Pinchas Breder of Ami, when you say Yesh ba'alim la'achar mita, is it Dafka kamarmar yesh ba'alim la'achar mita? Are you saying that explicitly? Meaning, dafka meaning 100%, in the sense that there are owners, and that the owner basically, even though he's dead, is still considered to be attached to this carbon, and therefore, if you bring the animal for the wrong person, you didn't do it. And so you got to bring another one, because although Reuven's not alive, Reuven still, before he died, he dedicated an animal, and so he has a responsibility to bring the animal. Odilma, or what it means is, or does it mean that it's actually referring to the Yorshim, right? And that basically what's happening is that the father died, Reuven died. Reuven had a carbon ola that was being mechaper on mitzvah say. Reuven died. Now his Yorshim, we'll call his Yorshim Levi, because we already used Shimon for something else. We'll call his Yorshim Levi and Yehuda. They bring the carbon for their father, but it's not mechaper for their father, it's mechaper for them. Meaning, if they've done other mitzvah say wrong, it gets a mitzvah say, it gets a kapara for them, right? And what that means is that if they bring the carbon for the wrong person, and we say that carbon doesn't work, they don't have to bring another replacement, because it helps them, and they could bring a carbon for themselves anytime they want, but it's no longer needed for their father because he's not alive. So when Rav Pinchas Breder of Ami said that there is ownership after mitah, does he mean that really, that even though a person's dead, they have a responsibility, or the state has a responsibility to bring a carbon? Or does it just mean for this aspect that it goes to the sons, and the sons are basically able to bring it for themselves, but if it was done incorrectly, it's not a big deal? So that was the question that Rav Ashi asked Rav Pinchas, and Amar Le Rav Pinchas Bray, the Rav Ami answered back, Dafka Kamina, no, I meant it literally. And what I meant was that if a father sins and he dies, and he separated an animal for that, and he dies, right? Then there's still a responsibility either on him, he's not alive, or his estate, his children, who somehow inherit that responsibility. And if the animal is done incorrectly, so it's shechted for somebody else, and he doesn't get a kapara, the estate has to bring another animal that was owed by the person who died. So that is the opinion of Rabbi Pinchas Breder of Ami. Next case, Vama Rava. Says Rava, where are we up to? I don't know, it's not 15 lines down, but it's the first word on a line. Ola Dorono. Says Rava, the reality is an Ola is a gift, meaning it's not essentially brought for a kapara, even though we've said over many times already that an Ola is mechaper on someone for mitzvah say, but the main purpose of an Ola is a gift to Hashem, right? Why? Why did I say that? Because says Rava Hechidami, what's the case of a person who's over a mitzvah say, and then he brings in Karban Ola. Ideleka tshuva, if he hasn't yet done tshuva on his mitzvah taseh, right? Again, he forgot to do a mitzvah taseh. He didn't, I don't know, wear tefillin, let's say, right? And he says, I feel bad for it. I want to bring a Karban Ola. So if he hasn't done tshuva, says Rava, then you can't bring a karban and say this forgives it for me. I didn't do tshuva yet. He's a rasha, or he's a rasha for this mitzvah, and bringing a karban is not going to bring him satisfaction. It's a disgusting thing to Hashem. Iga tshuva. Now, if he did do tshuva and said, I feel bad about what I did, I'm not going to do it again, read all the steps of tshuva, Hatanya, the Breita says that if a person's avar mitzvah taseh, a person goes against the mitzvah taseh of the Torah vishav, and he does tshuva, he gets mechila right away. Lo zazu mishamad shemochalim lo, right? He gets kapara right away. So what would be the purpose of the Karban Ola? Either you've done tshuva, in which case you really got rid of the sin already, or you didn't do tshuva, in which case the karban's not going to help. So clearly says Rava el shma min adoranu. You see that really it's just a gift to Hashem. Now we associate it, right, to a mitzvah taseh and say it's a good thing to bring a gift to Hashem if you've gone against a mitzvah taseh, but the essential function of the Karban Ola is not to give you forgiveness, because you did tshuva already. That's what gives you forgiveness. The Ola is extra, sort of a sorry kind of gift to Hashem. Now, says the Gemara, there's a little bit, the Gerson here is a little bit confused, right? Some take out this, it says, Chatat amish mechaper ola la'achar daran siman. This is a siman for the next statement. Tayanam yahachi, there's a Breita that supports this statement of Rava. Because what does the Breita say? Amar Rabbi Shimon, Chatat lama ba. Why do you bring a karban chatat? What do you mean lama ba? Ask the Gemara. What do you mean, why does it come? The Torah says why, lechaper, right? You bring a chatat to get a kapara. It always says that. No. But the question is lama ba lifnei ola. Why is it that when you bring a karban chatat and a karban ola, you always bring the karban chatat first? We had this earlier in the Masechta. Why is that? Because it's similar to praklit shenichnas, right? It's like a praklit they translate as like a lawyer, but like an arguer in front of Hashem, basically. That basically the praklit comes in, ritza praklit, right? The praklit, the one who makes the arguments and apologizes and justifies it, goes to Hashem and does tshuva, basically. Nichnas doron acharav, and then you bring in the gifts, right? So you basically appease Hashem with the karban chatat, which gives you a kapara. And then once you basically had appeasement, the ola comes second as mainly a gift. And so even though an ola has a function as forgiving, the main function of an ola is a gift. And that's the important halacha. Continues the Gemara now back to the Mishnah. So up to the two dots, a little bit more than a third of the way down. The exceptions to the rule that if you shecht an animal shalol lishma, it's kosher, but it doesn't count for the owners, are chutz min pesach ve'chatat. The two exceptions are karban pesach and a karban chatat. Now we'll get to chatat tomorrow. We're not going to get to it today, but first we're going to cover pesach. Why is it that if you bring a karban pesach for the wrong owners, the animal's not kosher? Pesach minolan. How do you know that a pesach that's shechted for the wrong person is pasul, is not kosher at all? Okay, dichtiv, based on the pasuk, says the Gemara, Shemar chodesh aviv v'asita pesach, right? You bring, sorry, I actually did the wrong one first. We're going to get to not bringing it for the right owner. This is where you bring a karban pesach, not for a karban pesach. I mean, you say it's an ola or shlamim or something else. So how do we know that? Because the pasuk says, Shemar chodesh aviv, observe chodesh aviv.
But the pesach is eaten in chabura. People can bring it for the family, for the Gemara and Pesachim clearly says it. So it's brought for a whole group, not just for necessarily for one person.
Right. But you have to designate that group. I'm saying the shalol shem balam would be if you brought it for a different group, right? You had, instead of group A, you brought it for group B. But just to be clear, we're talking here about where you shechted the karban pesach for a different. Well, we're going to see about both. But the first limud is where you shechted karban pesach for a shlamim. Let's say you say the wrong karban. So how do we know that? Because it says Shmar chodesh aviv v'asita pesach sheyu kol asiyotav l'shem pesach. Word ve'asita tells you have to do it just for a pesach. If you do it for the wrong thing, it's not kosher. Okay. Ashkechan shinoi kodesh. So there you see what's called shinoi kodesh. If instead of doing it for a pesach, you did it for a shlamim, I get it. It's not a pesach. But shinoi ba'alim minalan. How do you know if you change the owners? So as you just said, Ken, you have to designate a chabura to be your people eating the karban pesach. And it could be 20 people or 100 people, but let's say 20 people. But you do it for the wrong chabura. So the Kohen takes the karban pesach, and it's very confusing Erev Pesach, and says, I'm doing this for chabura B. And it turns out it's for chabura A. How do you know that's pasul? Right? Shino ba'alim minalan. Dichtiv, because it says, this is going way back into Bo, V'amartem zevach pesach hu, you call it a zevach pesach. Now remember, the word zevach can mean two things. It can mean zevachim, it can mean the general principle of karbanot, but the word zvicha as a verb is slaughtering the animal. So you say the zevach pesach, it's telling you shtei zvicha l'shem pesach, that the zvicha should be done for carbon pesach. Now that seems to be the same halacha. Imeno inyan l'shinoi kodesh, we don't need it to tell you have to do it for a Pesach, because we just said from the other pasuk you have to do it for a Pesach. So therefore we borrow it, so to speak, and we move it to Neo Inyan l'shinu ba'alim. We use it to tell you that it has to be done for the right owners. Okay, so that's how you see that you have to shech the carbon Pesach for the right purpose and for the right owners. Ashkal mitzvah. Okay, that tells you you're supposed to do it that way. But remember, the Torah always has to repeat things by kachim la'akev minalan. How do you know that it's a deal breaker? That if you do it wrong, it's puzzle. Because Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "V'zavachta Pesach Hashem Elokecha tzon ubakar." Right. Well, we'll get to this pasuk in a minute, but it says "v'zavachta," and the fact that it repeated the mitzvah of zvicha is to tell you that you have to really do it. So whenever it repeats it, it makes it say that not only is it a mitzvah to do it this way, you have to do it this way. Matif Rav Safra, thank you very much for quoting that pasuk. But this pasuk is well known to everybody for a whole nother halacha. Can you say that Zavachta Pesach is there to teach you this halacha, that if you do a carbon Pesach for the wrong purpose, it's pasul? Hami Baile, the kid Rav Nachman. We need it for the very famous quoted statement of Rav Nachman. Dam Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba Baravua. We are around 2/3 of the way down. My Gemara has a star and a half parentheses. Minayan, says Rav Nachman, in the name of Rabba Baravua, how do you know that if you have a Motar Pesach, Shkarev Shlamim, how do you know that if you have extra money left over or extra animals left over from carbon Pesach, right, that you can then bring the carbon as a Shlamim? Let's say you set aside a carbon Pesach, right, and for a group of people, and they never make it. Their flight gets canceled. So they don't come through Shalim for Pesach. The animal's not used for carbon Pesach. So what do you do with that animal? It was set aside for Kaddish, for a carbon Pesach. Says Rav Nachman, I'm Rabbi Baravua, you take that as a shlamim the next week, not on Pesach, right? But after the day of Erev Pesach, you bring it as a carbon shlamim. How do I know that? Shenemar, because of this very interesting pasuk, which says, "V'zavachta Pesach l'Hashem Elokecha tzon ubakar." Shech the Pesach to Hashem out of tzon ubakar, right? Tzon is sheep, bakar is cattle. What do you mean cattle? Hello, ain Pesach ba'al mina kfasim mina izim. Everyone knows that a carbon Pesach is a lamb or a goat. You can't bring a cow for a carbon Pesach. How do you say shech the carbon Pesach tzonu bakar? Mikan, says Rav Nachman, what we learn from this pasuk, beautiful limud, lemotara Pesach, that the extra Pesach. So the Pesach, of course, is only tzon, is only sheep and goats, right? But the extra of the Pesach, meaning if a Pesach is left over, or if there's money left over from a carbon Pesach, that money can be done lemotar Pesach sheila davar ba minat tzonu minat bakar. That money can be used for something that is brought, an animal, or either the animal or the money, for something that is brought for tzon and bakar. Now, which carbon is tzon and bakar? Ma'ninu shlamim. So the base of the Torah is saying that sometimes a Pesach becomes a shlamim. Okay, so that's a beautiful limud if it's left over. But back to our original question, you wanted to use the pasuk of Zavachta to tell you that you have to do a Pesach for the right purpose. I can't use the pasuk for that anymore. I have to use it for this other thing. El Amar of Safra says, Rav Safra, you're right. You can't use it for that, but you can use it for the following. It says V'zavachta Pesach, that's for the Rav Nachman, right? That you can bring an extra leftover Pesach as a shlamim. But it says if you continue it's not continue, but if you go earlier, it says Shamar Chodesh Aviv, right? That is, you have to observe the Chodesh Aviv and do all the things right. That's telling you the mitzvah b'shinoi kodesh. That we said earlier is that you're not allowed to change the kedusha of the carbon pesach. That's a mitzvah, not ma'akev. Then it says va'amartem zevach pesach. So it's another pasuk. It says do the carbon pesach. That's telling you shinoi ba'alim lemitzvah. That's telling you that you can't change the owners. And again, it's telling you you're not supposed to. How do I know that it's ma'akev? Who, the word who, is there to tell you la'akev bein hacha u bein hacha. So the extra word who is there to tell you that what I just told you you're supposed to do is absolutely necessary. You have to do it that way. And if you don't do it that way, it's pasul. So that is how we learn that if you shech the carbon pesach for either the wrong purpose or the wrong owners, it's pasul. Says the Gemara, okay, that's one limud. Ashkan zvicha. And again, we had this all earlier, if you recall. That's shchita. Zvicha means shechting the animal. But sharva don't minalan. How do you know if everything else, accepting the blood, walking the blood, pouring the blood on the Mizbeach, right? Kabbalah, holacha, zvicha, azrika. Says the Gemara, well, because one is enough. Ho v'gali gali. Since it revealed that one part is essential, every part's essential. Rav Ashi says, that's not really a strong enough answer for me. Ho v'gali gali lo amrina. That's not compelling enough. Just because it said it in one place does not mean it's everywhere else. Ela avodot minalan. So how do I know that you have to, all the avodot of Karban Pesach are ma'akev? Dichtiv, because there is a pasuk that we quote many, many times that basically summarizes all the karbanot. It says, Zot HaTorah, these are the rules, la'olah, lemincha, lezevach hashlamim, lechatat, lezevach hashlamim, lasham, limluim, lezevach hashlamim, I went backwards. But that basically all of the karbanot are compared to each other, and the principles that apply to one are basically applied to all the others. Vitanya, and further, the Braita explains, B'yom Savato et Bnei Yisrael Akrivet Karbanehem. It doesn't say Pesach in that pasuk we just quoted, but it does continue. The next pasuk in Tzav is the day Hashem commanded Moshe, Bnei Yisrael, to bring all their karbanot. What's that including? Zeh Bechor Maser Pesach. That's include the ones that aren't mentioned, the karban Bechor, Maser, and Pesach. And therefore, Hikishu HaKatuv L'Shlamim. The Torah is therefore comparing all the karbanot, including Pesach, to Shlamim, and therefore we learn Ma Shlamim, just like a karban Shlamim. Bein Shinoi Kodesh, Bein Shinoi Balam, Be'inan L'Mitzvah. A karban Shlamim, you need to do it for the right purpose and the right owner, at least L'Mitzvah. Af kol, so too by all karbanot, Bein Shinoi Kodesh, Bein Shinoi Balam, Mitzvah. There is essentially a mitzvah to do it for the right purpose, and furthermore, Kishlamim. The karban Pesach and every other karban is like the shlamim, meaning ma shlamim, says the Gemara, bein zvicha, ma shlamim bein zvicha bein shavodot lo chalakta behen lemitzvah. By shlamim, whether it's and we learned this earlier, it's the shchita, the kabbalah, the holacha, the zrika. You have to do all of those for the right purpose. Now remember, by shlamim, if you don't, it's not puzzle, but you're supposed to do it all correctly. So too by Pesach. There's no difference between the first avodah of shechting the animal and the rest of avodot by karban Pesach. But by Pesach, it's la'akev, because by Pesach we learn the special pasuk that says you have to do it, and by saying you have to do it means it's essential. But the limud from Shlamim is just like Shlamim. The principles of what you're supposed to do are do this by shchita, do it by everything else the same way. By karban Pesach, it's the same thing. Do it by karban Pesach for shchita, it's ma'akev. Do it for everything else. Well, now that you said that you learned this all from Shlamim, Elohu lamali, right? Remember earlier, we said that the word hu is what told you that you essentially have to do it, and it's ma'akev. Now you don't need that anymore, because you already learned from Shlamim that you're supposed to do it. Remember, we said one pasuk is la mitzvah, and hu was la'akev. But now we just said you don't need a pasuk la mitzvah, because for la mitzvah that you're supposed to do it correctly, you learn from Shlamim. So what's the pasuk by Pesach? That's la'akev. So what do you need the word hu for? Elohu lamali, 6 lines from the bottom. It says, well, that's kiditanya, likiditanya. That's for the following limud from the Braita. The Braita says, Nemar b'Pesach hu b'shchita la'akev. By Pesach, it says the word hu when it's talking about slaughtering it, and therefore it tells you that hu is ma'akev. Hu tells you, do it this way. Aval asham, but when you get to the karban asham, lo nemar bohu, it does say the word asham hu, but it only says the word asham hu, la'achar haktarat emurim. It's only after you bring the pieces on the Mizbeach, and that it can't tell you that asham is required, because hu atzmo shlo tu emurav kasher. If you didn't even do the emurim, it's kasher. Remember, we've had earlier that the main point of a karban is the blood. Once you bring the blood on the Mizbeach, if you lose all the limbs or they become tamei or something happens to them, you already brought your karban. And so the limbs are not mechayev, and therefore the word hu by Pesach is ma'akev. The word hu by Asham is not ma'akev, and that is the limud. And so we are going to stop there. 2 lines on the bottom.
But you can bring the Pesach as a Shlomim later on, though.
Right, but not on Erev Pesach. So when it's not,
Later on, next week.
Correct. So a Pesach that's done bismano, either shalol shem ba'alim or shalol shem the right mitzvah, is puzzle.
What happens if that animal that you made a mistake, you said designated Shlomim instead of Pesach, you can bring it next week? What happens if that animal runs away, disappears, you can't find it? You've said can't bring it as a Pesach because you had wrong intention, said Shlomim. See, you set it aside for Shlomim, the animal now disappears.
You mean there's nothing to do. I mean, you just it disappeared. You got to hope to
No,
find
you had
it.
to find it. Can you bring another animal to replace the shlomim that you said you were going to use?
Oh, yeah. So we'll get to that later, actually. I mean, do you have a personal responsibility is your question. So remember, a lot of it depends on whether you say this animal or a animal, right?
Oh, okay, that's a separate thing. I mean, but the point is that you had a shlomim. You made a mistake for Pesach. You said, oh, it's a shlomim, whatever. You can't use it as a Pesach. So you set it aside for shlomim. The animal disappears. You have to find another animal to replace the one that you were supposed to use for the shlomim instead of the Pesach for which you made the mistake.
So presumably not, but it depends on how you said the carbon pesach. Meaning, did you say it as a neder or nedava, as we said earlier?
Well, I mean, you got a korban Pesach, but you can't, for whatever reason, you made a mistake. She said, now the animal is the shlomim. But now the animal disappeared.
So again, if you said this animal is my carbon pesach and the animal disappears, you don't have to replace it,
No, I'm
right?
not talking about the korban. I'm talking about the animal we said Pesach. You made a mistake, so forth. Now that animal can be used as a shlomim next week.
Correct.
Its own. Okay? So now now you have to replace the korban Pesach. You get another korban Pesach, but you still have this animal, the shlomim, on the side. What
Correct.
happens if the shlomim disappears?
So it depends on how you initially dedicated the carbon pesach. If you said I will bring it, so presumably you don't have to let's just say in most cases you would not have to replace it. It's just a nedava, you don't have to replace it. There could be exceptions. I'll leave it at that. But most of the time you won't have to because it's just a regular nedava. Remember, anytime you give a gift, if the gift gets lost on the way, you don't have to replace it. Okay. Well, ktiva v'chatima tova.
Hopefully you find a nice synagogue there where you are.
I'm hoping to come home today. So that's my plan, to get a flight in a couple hours. But thank you.
Oh, well.
Okay, have a good day. Bye.